Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something I think we all struggle with a little bit: personal responsibility. To help us out, we're diving deep into The Responsibility Process by Christopher Avery.
Yeah, this book is really fascinating. It dives into the psychology of how we deal with problems, and this pattern Avery calls the responsibility process.
Yeah, so I read this whole book, and I think the thing that really stood out to me was that it wasn't just theory. Avery lays out some pretty concrete tools to actually change your thinking and become more empowered. I mean, who doesn't want that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like even when things go wrong, we actually have a lot more control than we might realize.
I think a lot of times we get caught up in just being responsible, right? Like showing up on time, doing our tasks. But Avery says there's a big difference between that and taking responsibility.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Being responsible is often about meeting those expectations that other people put on us. Taking responsibility is more about recognizing our own power to actually influence stuff in our lives. Avery uses this great example of this woman struggling with her family's cultural expectations.
Oh, yeah. She felt obligated to keep up all these traditions that were actually making her unhappy. And Avery's point is that even in situations that seem like they're totally out of our control, we always have a choice in how we react to them. Like she could either just go along with it and be resentful about it, or she could totally embrace it, or even try to negotiate a new way of relating to her family and their traditions.
Right. It's like realizing that we're not just reacting to the world, we're actually creating our experience.
Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of this responsibility process. Avery outlines these different mental states that we cycle through when we're faced with a problem. So imagine you're about to give this big presentation and you spill coffee all over yourself. How do you think most people would react in that moment?
I think a lot of us would jump straight to lay blame, wouldn't we? It's almost instinctive to look for something or someone else to blame. Like, who bumped into me? Why is this coffee cup so flimsy?
Oh my God, totally. I can totally see myself doing that. But Avery says by laying blame, we're basically giving away our power.
Exactly. It keeps us in this victim mentality where we're focused on what we can't control instead of actually finding a solution to the problem.
And then it's so easy to just fall into justify, where we come up with all these excuses for why something happened. Well, of course I spilled the coffee. I was rushing because my boss dumped this last-minute task on me. Have you ever caught yourself doing that?
Oh, all the time. It's amazing how good we are at rationalizing our actions. Avery actually tells this funny story about losing his car keys to illustrate that. We've all been there, frantically searching, while simultaneously justifying to ourselves why we misplaced them.
It's so relatable. It's like we're trying to convince ourselves that it's not really our fault.
But here's the interesting thing. Avery says that while justify might seem harmless, it can actually prevent us from learning and growing from our mistakes. We're so busy explaining away our mistakes that we don't really take the opportunity to examine our role in this situation.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And then there's shame, which can be really brutal. You know that voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough. Avery talks about a time when he felt so ashamed that he couldn't find the right candidate for a job.
Oh, yeah. And what's really powerful about that story is how he realized that he was telling himself this really limiting story. It wasn't actually about his abilities. It was about that negative self-talk he was engaging in.
So instead of taking ownership of the situation and maybe figuring out a solution, he was just stuck in that cycle of blaming himself, punishing himself for being human.
Right, and that kind of shame can be totally paralyzing. It saps our energy and makes it really hard to actually take any action.
This is so interesting because I feel like a lot of times society kind of confuses shame with responsibility. We get praised for taking responsibility when we feel bad about our mistakes. But Avery's saying that's not true responsibility at all. It's just another way to avoid actually dealing with the problem.
Totally. It's about realizing that making mistakes is just part of being human. And true responsibility is about how we choose to respond to those mistakes.
Okay, so we've got lay blame, justify, and shame. What happens when we just get completely fed up with the whole situation?
Well, then we might slip into obligation. It's where we kind of feel trapped and resentful. We go through the motions, but we're not really engaged. Like going to a meeting you really don't want to be at.
Ugh, yeah. You're there physically, but definitely not mentally. And Avery says that obligation leads to low-level performance and even resentment because we're coming from this place of I have to, instead of I choose to.
Right. It's like telling ourselves we don't have any choice in the matter, which is really disempowering. And it can definitely show up in our personal lives too, like feeling obligated to keep up family traditions that don't really resonate with you anymore.
Okay, so we've covered lay blame, justify, shame, and obligation. Where do we go from there? What happens when we're so exhausted that we just want to give up completely?
That's when quit might feel really tempting. We mentally check out, even if we don't physically walk away. Remember how Avery talks about putting off writing his book because he just wasn't feeling ready?
Oh yeah, that's so relatable. We've all got those tasks that we keep pushing aside and hoping they'll just magically disappear.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Quitting, even if it feels like a relief in the moment, doesn't actually solve the problem. It just creates more anxiety and stress later on down the line.
It's like we're giving up on our power to create any kind of change, which just leaves us feeling even more stuck and powerless.
Yeah, and that's really what Avery's trying to show us with all these mental states.
Hmm.
They're all different ways to avoid taking real responsibility. It's like shying away from the challenge and the power we have to actually deal with it.
So it's like a map of all the mental detours we take to avoid owning our experience.
Yeah, exactly. But once we understand these patterns, we can start making better choices about how we respond to challenges. It's about recognizing those mental detours and choosing a different path.
Okay, so if all of these states are about averting responsibility, what does it actually mean to be in a state of responsibility?
Well, that's the good part.
Yeah.
Responsibility is all about owning your power to create the life that you want. And it doesn't mean pretending that, everything's perfect. It means choosing how you respond to those difficult emotions.
So it's not about pretending everything is fine, but about realizing that we do have the power to influence our experience, even when things are tough.
Exactly. So acknowledging that, yeah, challenges exist, but we still have choices in how we handle them.
That is a big mindset shift. So how do we actually move from those avoidance states to actually owning our experience? Avery gives us these 3 keys to help us do that, right?
He does. He calls them intention, awareness, and confront.
All right, those sound interesting. Let's dive into those in part 2 of our depth dive.
Okay, so we left off talking about those 3 keys to responsibility: intention, awareness, and confront. Let's break those down a bit, starting with intention.
Yeah, intention is really powerful. It's about making that conscious choice, choosing what you want and setting those clear goals for yourself. Avery actually describes it as a sort of carrier wave, like it guides our actions toward what we actually want.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. It's like setting your internal compass.
Yeah.
Right? And speaking of compasses, Avery has this really amazing story about how he always wanted to live on a hill with a view. And years later, he made it happen just from holding on to that intention. Yeah. It's a perfect illustration of how powerful that intention can be. And it's not about, just wishing and hoping for things. It's about actually aligning your actions with what you're trying to create.
So less about wishing and hoping and more about actually steering yourself in the direction you want to go. Okay, what about awareness?
So awareness is all about paying attention. It's about tuning in to your thoughts and your feelings and your actions, especially when a problem triggers those negative mental states we were talking about. Avery connects this to the idea of perfect problems.
Perfect problems. What are those?
The perfect problems are like those recurring patterns or challenges that just keep popping up in our lives. Like always being late or constantly butting heads with that one coworker.
Yeah, those are the worst. So what do we do about them?
Well, instead of just getting frustrated, Avery suggests we try to see them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Oh, interesting. So those perfect problems are like showing us where we're getting stuck in the responsibility process.
Yeah, exactly. By paying attention to them, we can figure out where we're taking those mental detours and start making different choices.
So it's like those frustrating patterns are actually giving us some valuable information about ourselves. Okay, I like it. What about confront?
All right, so confront. I know that word can sound kind of intense.
Yeah, it makes me think of big dramatic confrontations.
Yeah, but that's not what Avery means here. For him, confront is more about just facing the problem head on, like not shying away from it or getting caught up in all those mental gymnastics we do to avoid it.
Right, so being honest with ourselves about what's really going on. Avery's story about his broken awning is a great example of that.
Oh yeah, tell me about that one.
So he kept putting off fixing this broken awning because he just assumed it was going to be this big, complicated thing and he couldn't find the right parts. But when he finally just stopped avoiding it and actually looked at the problem, he realized there was a really simple solution.
It's a perfect example of how sometimes our own assumptions and avoidance can create bigger problems than the actual situation.
It's so true. So we've got intention setting the direction, awareness highlighting the problem areas, and confront pushing us to take action. Those are some powerful tools. How do we actually apply them in our everyday lives, though?
That's where Avery's practical strategies and games come in. He gives us these little exercises to practice those skills and, like, train our minds to make those shifts. My favorite is the catch sooner game.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that one. It sounds intriguing.
It's so simple, but so effective. So imagine you're feeling really frustrated because, I don't know, a project is behind schedule.
Yeah.
And you're tempted to blame your coworker for, dropping the ball. That's the first step. You catch yourself in that negative thought pattern.
Right. So becoming aware of that knee-jerk reaction to blame someone else.
Right. And then comes the change part, where you make a conscious choice to respond differently.
Yeah.
So instead of blaming your coworker, you could say, hey, how can we work together to get this project back on track?
It's like going from pointing fingers to problem solving together.
Exactly. And then comes the most important part, forgive. You're not going for perfection here. You're going for progress. We're human. We're going to mess up sometimes. It's about recognizing that and being kind to ourselves.
I love that. It's about giving yourself permission to be human. We don't have to get it right every single time.
Exactly. And then the last step is vow. You make a vow to catch yourself sooner, next time. So the next time you're in a similar situation, your goal is to notice that negative pattern even earlier.
It's like building a habit of taking responsibility.
Exactly. And speaking of building habits, Avery has another game, the daily scorecard game. I think you'll like this one.
Oh, I love a good tracking system. Tell me more.
So with this one, you're basically bringing awareness to your mental patterns throughout the day. Choose one mental state you really want to work on, like, let's say, lay blame. Then you make a little scorecard. Every time you catch yourself blaming someone, you mark it down. Every time you slip up, you mark that down too.
It's like a mindfulness practice where you're becoming more aware of your thoughts and reactions as they happen.
Exactly. And what's fun about it is that the scoring system actually rewards you for catching yourself early, which makes it more motivating.
It's like gamifying your own personal growth. I like that. We've talked a lot about personal responsibility so far. What about when it comes to working with others? How does this whole responsibility process play out in like a team setting?
That's where things get really interesting.
Right.
Avery introduces this concept he calls the trim tab. It's this small lever that can steer a huge ship.
Oh, I love that analogy. Like sometimes those small actions can have a ripple effect.
Exactly. So imagine you're working on a team project and everyone's pointing fingers, blaming each other when things go wrong. It's easy to fall into that not my job mentality.
Ugh, yeah, it's so frustrating when everyone's just trying to avoid responsibility instead of actually fixing the problem.
That's where the trim tab comes in. Avery suggests that even if you don't have, like, formal authority in a situation, you can still be a leader by taking responsibility for your own actions and encouraging others to do the same.
It reminds me of that Gandhi quote, "Be the change you wish to see." How do we actually do that, though, especially when everyone around you is being negative and blaming others?
Avery gives a few really practical tips. One is to focus on what you can control instead of wasting energy on things you can't.
So it's about choosing your battles and making sure you're directing your efforts where they'll actually make a difference.
Exactly. Another tip is to try to approach conflicts as opportunities to collaborate and problem solve. Instead of getting stuck in the blame game, ask, how can we work together to fix this?
So it's about shifting the mindset from us versus them to we're all in this together. But what about when you're dealing with someone who just seems determined to be negative no matter what?
Oh, I know the type. Avery actually tells a story about a teammate who always found a way to turn every positive into a negative.
Oh, those people can be so draining. How did he deal with that?
Instead of getting dragged down by the negativity, Avery decided to confront it directly. He simply asked the teammate, are you reporting a win or a loss?
Wow, I love that. Such a simple but powerful way to call out that behavior. It forces them to become aware of the impact their words are having.
Exactly. And by doing so, he was actually able to help the teammate shift their perspective and start focusing on the positive. It's about creating a culture where people feel comfortable acknowledging both wins and losses without getting caught up in negativity.
So it's about leading by example and showing people that it's possible to approach challenges in a more responsible and empowered way.
Yeah, exactly. And when you start to see yourself as that trim tab leader, you can actually create a ripple effect that inspires others to step up and do the same.
This whole conversation about the trim tab and taking responsibility within teams is making me think about how much power we all have to shape our work environments, even if we don't have like the official title of leader.
It's about recognizing that leadership isn't just a position. It's a choice that we can all make.
By shifting our mindset towards responsibility, we can create more positive and productive experiences for ourselves and everyone around us.
That's the beauty of the responsibility process. It's not about blame or guilt. It's about empowerment and choice.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've gone from those sneaky mental states that keep us stuck to exploring all these tools to take ownership and even become those trim tab leaders in our workplaces.
It's been an awesome exploration of how responsibility is really about freedom.
And I have a feeling there's even more to unpack. In part 3, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the responsibility process and talk about some of the big picture takeaways and what it all means for our lives. So, as we've been talking about all of this, I've been thinking about how much time we spend focusing on what's happening to us instead of, on how we're reacting to it.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in feeling like, like a victim of circumstance.
Totally. But Avery is basically saying we have way more power than we realize.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was how he brings in all these different ideas from philosophy and psychology and even history to show how personal responsibility has been this like recurring theme in human experience.
Oh, I loved that. Like when he talks about Socrates, that ancient Greek philosopher, he was all about taking responsibility for like your thoughts and your actions. It's not just some, modern self-help concept. It's been around forever.
Yeah, and then there's Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor. He wrote about how even in the most horrific circumstances, we still have that power to choose how we're going to respond.
It's true. It makes you think, right? Taking responsibility isn't about having a perfect life or never having to deal with any kind of hardship. It's about like how we deal with those challenges when they inevitably come up.
Exactly. And Avery makes this really important point about self-efficacy. That belief in yourself that you can actually succeed.
Yeah, if we don't believe that we can make a difference, like why would we even try?
Right. But if we can cultivate that belief in ourselves, we're more likely to actually take those risks, step up, and achieve our goals.
It's all about mindset, isn't it? It's not just about the external stuff. It's our beliefs and that willingness to own our experience.
And Avery gives us so many practical ways to actually shift our mindset. Like those mental games we were talking about, those are so simple, but they really work. They help us notice those thought patterns and make different choices.
And he talks about clarifying our intentions too, like really getting crystal clear on what it is that we want.
Yeah, he even talks about good goals versus bad goals. Good goals, they energize us. Bad goals just feel like obligations.
It's about moving beyond that sense of obligation and like really living from a place of choice. I like that.
I think the biggest takeaway for me was this idea that responsibility is a practice. It's not just something you're born with or not. We can all get better at it, but it takes effort.
And the more we flex that responsibility muscle, the more freedom and power we unlock in our lives.
Yeah, it's about shifting from feeling like we're at the mercy of our circumstances to recognizing that we can actually shape our own experience.
This deep dive into the responsibility process has been incredible. It's definitely made me rethink my own relationship with responsibility and how I approach all the challenges that life throws my way.
It's not always easy, though, is it, to own our role in everything, especially when things feel really unfair.
But that's what I appreciate about Avery's approach. He's not trying to sugarcoat things. He acknowledges all of the things we do to avoid responsibility. But by doing that, he actually gives us the power to choose differently. So, listeners, what resonated most with you from this deep dive? What mental state do you find yourself in most often? And what's one small step you can take today to practice taking more responsibility? Keep exploring these ideas because we're all capable of so much more than we often realize.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.